Herman Umberger told the hired girl to give the two strangers chairs at the coal stove and to stir up the fire, because the men said they were cold. Inside the hour, he was dead on his own kitchen floor, and the savings he had carried in his bootlegs for years were going back over the mountain in the dark. He was 67 and had been ill since New Year's Day. The farm was nearly 200 acres 2 miles north of Jennertown in Somerset County, Pennsylvania, on the turnpike that ran up toward Johnstown, and among farmers of that county who had no use for banks, the money stayed in the house. The evening was the 27th of February, 1889, raw and wet. His wife Nancy was near 70, and their granddaughter Nanny Horner, who was 10, was in the sitting room with them. The hired girl, Ella Stern, was 20. Umberger told the men they were strangers, and they agreed that they were, out of Bedford. He told them they were on the wrong road for Somerset. They told him he did not know their business. The taller of the two had his face tied up in 2 handkerchiefs, and the shorter one, who did all the talking, explained that his companion had broken his jaw falling out of a buggy. The shorter one was wearing a gray wig and a false gray beard. He took a folded paper out of his pocket and read it aloud, a search warrant for a box of jewelry lost by a peddler, and said he was obliged to search every house between Jenner and Johnstown. Umberger asked whether it had been endorsed. Yes, the man said. At Squire Rauch's, 2 men on that errand sat by that stove for half an hour and hurried nobody. We take these cases apart one household at a time, so subscribe and stay with this one. The paper went back into the pocket, and the man sat a little longer. Then he said he supposed he would have to search. You can, Umberger told him, but you cannot find anything here. Nancy said the same thing. Then he told Ella Stern to go into the kitchen and bring a light. She lit a tallow candle and carried it in, and he took it from her and went ahead of them with it. The parlor first. He held the light over the table where the small things were kept, and the man said there was nothing there. Then the bedroom, with Umberger and his wife, and the child, following the man in, and the taller one hanging back in the doorway where he could watch both rooms at once. Umberger opened the top bureau drawer himself, let the man look into it, and shut it again. The man wanted the one below. It was full of clothes, and he told Nancy to take them out, and she would not, and she shut it. Then he wanted the next one down. That was the second drawer from the top, and that was where the money was. Nancy opened it a little way, and he saw the 2 pocketbooks lying in it, one larger than the other, and Herman Umberger, standing in his own bedroom, holding a candle for a stranger with a folded paper, explained them. He had 2, he said, because he had to keep a little money on hand to pay the hands. The man told him he was looking for jewels and not for money, and that she need not open them. Those 2 pocketbooks went everywhere with him. He carried them in his bootlegs by day and put them in that drawer at night, and his brother Perry, who traveled with him on business, had seen one of them in his bootleg 100 times, more or less. He wanted the bureau pulled away from the wall in case there was a false back behind it, and they pulled it out, and he looked, and they pushed it back. Then he wanted the big top drawer taken out of the frame altogether, so that he could see down into the little one underneath it. Nancy Umberger got angry and began talking Dutch at him. He told her he did not understand any Dutch. She told him she would teach him to understand it, and that she would raise the neighbors. The 2 men turned around and walked out of the bedroom. A woman near 70 had refused to take clothes out of a drawer, and that was the end of the arrangement. Everybody in that house had been pretending to accept for the last half hour. Umberger reached into the drawer and took both pocketbooks out of it. He stepped behind the door, put them inside his vest, laid his hand flat across them, and walked out into the sitting room after the men. That was the last thing he ever did with his own property. His wife came out last, and by the time she was through the doorway, the shorter man was up close to her husband with a revolver, calling for his money or his life. Umberger put his hands up, and the man backed him across the room toward the corner where the bookcase stood. Ella Stern was standing near the kitchen door. She went out through the kitchen onto the porch, and she was still on the porch when she heard the first shot, and then she ran for Friedlein's. Nancy thought that if she could only get into the kitchen before he shot her too. She got there, and she rang the bell. It was the harvest bell, the one they used in summer to call the hands in from the fields, and on a wet night in February, it was the only thing on that place that would carry. Then she came back into the room, and her husband was down, and she took hold of him, because she thought he might not be dead. He was dead. She was the first person to reach him, and the one who found that out. Going out through the dining room afterward, she stepped on the broken globe of the lamp. Annie Horner came through the house, crying that her grandfather was shot, and that she had to run to Friedlein's, and the people there heard her coming before she was near the house. Nancy counted 4 or 5 shots, and then said 5 or 6, and that she could not tell definitely. 2 of them were in him. One had gone into the shoulder. The other had gone in between the 7th and 8th ribs and reached the heart. 2 brothers were arrested for it inside of 5 days. Both were convicted. Both were hanged 2 years and 1 month later. And of everything that walked out of that house inside Herman Umberger's vest, his family got back 1 empty pocketbook. Several hundred people came to the farm that night. Henry Rausch, the justice of the peace at Jennertown, impaneled a jury of inquest in Herman Umberger's own house, and Dr. B.F. Walker of Jennertown made the post-mortem examination in it. The lamp on the table had no chimney on it, and the pieces of the chimney lay on the floor, 5 to 10 feet away. Outside, the weather had already decided what could and could not be found. Around Jennertown, the snow had gone to slush and mud, and west of the ridge it had disappeared altogether. But on the mountain itself, it still lay several inches deep, because Jennertown stands nearly 900 feet higher above tide water than Ligonier does. So the tracks existed only in the middle of the route. 2 sets, 1 leather boot and 1 rubber, over the fields above the house and along the turnpike, and down the western slope, ending somewhere beyond Burnt Cabin. Nobody in authority could offer a reward for him. His son John, who was constable there, rode into Somerset the next morning to ask the county commissioners to post one, and the court told him the law gave them no power to do it. So his brother did it. Perry Umberger announced $2,000 for the return of the money and $500 for an arrest and conviction, and a neighbor was sent to Pittsburgh to hire detectives because there was nobody else to send. Officers from Johnstown went over the mountain the next night and knocked at a house near the western foot of it, and an old woman opened the door and begged them not to go upstairs because somebody would be killed. Under the pillow of the young man they found in bed were 2 loaded revolvers and $30 in gold and paper. Told he would have to be handcuffed, he said that was all right, he was used to that. On the outside of his bedroom door, in white chalk, were the words, "Death to all who enter." His name was Collins Hamilton. They stood him in the Umberger sitting room in front of Nancy Umberger and Ella Stern and the 10-year-old child, and the 3 of them looked at a stranger. On the 4th of Art, that same constable arrested 2 brothers at their houses in Ligonier Township. The next morning they were brought back over the mountain to a hearing at the justice's house in Jennertown, upstairs, in a room with at least 12 people in it. One of the 12 was a private detective from Pittsburgh named Gilkinson, and everybody there believed he was a newspaper correspondent called Evans. He had been introduced under that name at the Umberger house, and he spent the next hour arranging what happened in this one. He suggested the prisoners be searched again in front of the room, with an inventory taken. When the question came up of how much of the money belonged to which brother, the shorter one answered it himself, and answered it loudly. $4.16, he said, was what he had. Ella Stern came up out of her chair. That was the voice. The widow nodded. Before the room had settled, the constable searching, the taller brother pulled a red handkerchief covered in round white dots out of his left hip pocket, and she was on her feet again before it was clear of the cloth. "That is the handkerchief," she called out, twice. There was a second red handkerchief in that room, a dirty one with spots of a different pattern, and the prisoner seized both, held up the wrong one, and asked her why she said that this was the handkerchief. She corrected him. It was the new one he had there. The detective said he would not dare let her put it on him the way he had worn it that night. He said he dared. So she took the new handkerchief and folded it the way she had watched it, folded across a man's face for half an hour beside a coal stove, and tied it on him. The second went round his chin and over the crown of his head. Then she told him he was the man. Gilkinson wrote afterward that he had never seen anything on a stage do to a room what that did. Then he did the thing a witness would not have thought of. He sent downstairs for the justice of the peace and had Ella Stern say the whole of it over again under oath, because he knew what lawyers would try with it at the trial. The two men were committed for trial that evening, and everything taken off them at the jail was being matched against the last half hour of Herman Umberger's life. A gray overcoat, a pair of gum boots and a pair of leather boots, and a brown derby with a piece broken out of the rim which Ella Stern had been able to describe because she sat behind it at the stove. It was on the shorter brother's head at the moment they arrested him. Two covered buggies came back over the mountain from that hearing, and the detective was in the second one. Near the top they met a third coming the other way with two men in derby hats in it. The hired driver from the first buggy ran back and said something to its driver, and after a little talk about how the hearing had gone, the man in the third buggy called out that he would take it now. The driver went back to his wagon, and a moment later there was a large black pocketbook lying on the lap robe across the knees of the two men in derby hats, 7 or 8 inches long, and at one end of it a white spot where the leather looked as though it had been split off with a knife. Gilkinson wrote that he had never seen a pocketbook marked like that. He asked in a whisper who was giving it and who was taking it. The man receiving it was a brother-in-law to the two men who had just been committed for trial. He took $100 out of it and put the pocketbook in a safe in Ligonier. He said nothing about any of it to the officers at the time, and admitted afterward that he had lied about it. On the 21st of March, 22 days after two men had walked into Herman Umberger's house with a warrant they had forged, officers walked into a farmhouse in Ligonier Valley with one that was real. There were at least 12 people in the room. The old couple who lived there were Anthony Nicely and his wife, and their 2 sons were in the Somerset County Jail. Mrs. Nicely went upstairs and brought the pocketbook down herself and put it into their hands. They asked for the money as well. There was none. The pocketbook was empty. Anthony Nicely was arrested as an accessory after the fact in the murder of Herman Umberger. The gray overcoat had been out of everybody's reach for 3 months. Taken from the taller brother's house on the day of the arrest, it had sat in a back room belonging to the deputy sheriff, who showed it to nobody until he handed it back on the Friday the trial opened. 3 months earlier, a 10-year-old had told them what was on it, a little brown patch on the side. Buttons gone, buttonholes torn. The defense put Nanny Horner through a long cross-examination, and a former congressman worked her over with the wrong coat first. He held the lined side toward her and asked where the patch was, and she said on the side of the coat. He showed her one side and asked whether that was the side of the coat, and she asked him whether it had not got another side. He put a different patch in front of her and asked whether there was another one. "That other one is the one, though," she said. Then she found it for herself and said that was it. Ella Stern went through the overalls and both overcoats, and when they asked her about a pair of boots, she said plainly she could not tell whether those were the ones. Then the pocketbook. 6 witnesses identified it as Herman Umberger's by the eyelet, the wear, the creases, and the white spot, and one of them was his brother Perry, who had seen it 100 times and knew how it had worn. 5 members of the Nicely family swore in that same room that it was not the one. The mother who had carried it down her own stairs, the sister who had laid it on a table, the brother-in-law who had taken $100 out of it. The wife of the younger brother sat through those 9 days with a 2-year-old child in her arms, and when the defense rose to ask the sister whether it was the same pocketbook, the court stopped the question. Months later, the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania wrote a full section of its opinion on why she could be asked where the thing had traveled and not what it was. Both brothers put themselves at home all day on the 27th, and one of the wives swore she had sewn those patches on the day after. The trial ran 9 days. The jury came back with a verdict that did not state the degree of the crime and was sent out to write it properly. It came back with murder in the first degree, and each of the 12 was made to say so out loud. At noon on the 16th of September, 1889, the day watchman at the Somerset County Jail went out for water for the prisoners. Deputy Sheriff Milton McMillan unlocked the door from the outside to let him back in and started pushing it shut behind him. Joseph Nicely got between him and the door with a revolver in the deputy's face. McMillan decided he would rather fight than raise his hands, and during the scuffle, he got the door locked, but the key was still in it, and his brother reached through and turned it back. The plan, McMillan said afterward, had been to tie and gag the 2 of them and put them in a cell so that every prisoner in the jail would be gone before the town knew anything about it. He was shot twice. The second ball was aimed at his heart and was turned by a small passbook in his upper vest pocket, and he carried it in his body for the rest of his life. He got a rifle from a side room, followed as far as the wash house, found he was too weak, and went back and locked the jail door. What went through the town that afternoon was that the Niceleys had killed the deputy sheriff. Nearly everybody in Somerset was at dinner, and it is doubtful whether anyone inside the borough limits finished one. Both men were back in custody before evening, out of a stand of timber east of town called Oak Ridge. The taller brother was found up a young tree and came down with his hands raised, begging not to be shot and not to be lynched, saying it was not him that had done the shooting. The crowd that met them wanted a hanging on the spot, and the men who had hunted them hardest were the men who stood in front of them. In 3 weeks, the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania would sit in Pittsburgh to hear whether these 2 had been properly convicted of killing Herman Umberger, and in November it would rule that they had. Public feeling, which had begun to soften toward men convicted largely on the word of 3 women, hardened that afternoon and never softened again. Among the men who had gone into the woods after them was a minister of the Evangelical Association named A.J. Beale, who fired a revolver at Joseph Nicely and cut his hair with a ball. The Board of Pardons refused them twice in 1890, in the spring and again in the autumn. 17 days after the second refusal, they went down a rope, 50 feet to the ground, out of a jail called one of the strongest in the country. The taller brother was found 2 days later under hay in a stable, an arm and a leg broken from the drop. His brother came back as well, and the record cannot agree on how, but from that week onward, the men who watched him described fits of depression that came more and more often. Then, in January of 1891, a man named Beach swore a statement saying that he had been present when Herman Umberger was shot, and that the man who fired had drowned in the Johnstown flood. The flood had come on the last day of May in 1889, 3 months after that evening, in the farmhouse, and while the trial was still being argued in Somerset. It came down the valley on the far side of the same mountain the 2 men were said to have crossed, and it took more than 2,000 people. So the one man who could have answered for Beach's story had gone into that water with everybody else. He could not be produced or questioned or ruled out. It went to the governor on the 10th of that month, and with it went affidavits from witnesses who had identified the brothers at the trial, and now said they had been mistaken. He had already spent months on the case privately. On the 21st of January, the day before his term ran out, he signed both warrants. The sheriff wanted a death watch over the two men and could not have one because the county commissioners refused to authorize it, and so did the judge. A death watch being an old English custom that was never written into the law of Pennsylvania. So he appointed 4 men on his own responsibility, in 6-hour turns, and one of the 4 was Milton McMillan. At 11 o'clock on the morning of the 1st of April, the bathtub in the exercise corridor on the upper floor of the jail was filled with water. The sheriff came up with his household, and the watchman, and 4 prisoners, and members of Elder Calvin Granger's congregation, and a man from the press, and the official court stenographer. Granger read the 6th chapter of Romans aloud, received David Nicely's profession of faith, put him under the water, and prayed over him. Down in his cell through all of it, Joseph Nicely lay face downward with his head close to the bars, placed so that he could hear every word and steal a look without appearing to attend. When a spectator came by immediately afterward, his face was turned the other way, and he seemed to be asleep. The confession was taken the same day, and the way it was taken says something about the room. Granger sat with his back to the guards, as though the 2 of them were talking about nothing, and took it down 1 sentence at a time. It opens with 11 words. I was present when Herman Umberger was murdered, it says, and that line undid 2 years of sworn denial. He had left home about 1 in the afternoon of the 27th of February. The errand was a robbery in Somerset County, and not a murder, and whose house it was to be, he did not learn until he was well along the road. The pistol he carried he had fired into the ceiling to frighten the old man, and no shot of his had struck him. Then it turns on the witnesses, and it turns on them by name. Hamilton Smith's testimony was false. Beener and McCracken had never met him on the pike. The Vaniers could not have recognized him where they said. The pocketbook produced in court was bogus. 4 men called liars on the last full day of his life. Nancy Umberger is not in it. Ella Stern is not in it. Nanny Horner is not in it. And there is nothing in it about the money. The minister noticed while he was still holding the paper and remarked that more than $20,000 had been taken. The people were mistaken about that, David told him, and it was very far from that amount. He did not say what the amount had been. He did not say where it had gone. The way he said it left the impression that it was no longer his to give back, and it was not pressed any further. A few days before, the sheriff had watched him tear up a manuscript and drop it down the dry closet. So the pocketbook that 6 men had sworn was Herman Umberger's had now been called a forgery by the one man alive who admitted he was in the room. That evening he took his first and last communion and said it seemed like mockery to have reveled in sin through a life, and then asked the Lord to take him. Somewhere in the same hours, a telegram reached the sheriff, unsigned, warning him that an armed party had set out from the Ligonier side of the mountain to take the 2 men out of his jail. He put 4 more men on the outside of the building for the night. Nobody came. Granger stayed with him until 11:15. His brother had not spoken a word in about 3 weeks. A physician had come out from Harrisburg to look at him. What he watched was a man working the back half of a cell in a methodical way, shaking the washhand, running his hand along the wall until it met a projecting rib, passing his fingers up and down the angle iron. Then he crossed the room and began again, and he never once went near the bars. He had come in expecting a simulation, said so in his own report, and then wrote that he undoubtedly believed the man insane. By then, there was a new governor in Harrisburg, and he did not act on it. Shortly after 6, on the morning of the 2nd of April, half an hour after the night watch was relieved, Joseph Nicely struck his hand across his forehead, like a man coming up out of a dream. He asked how he had got into this cell and what day it was. When the deputy came in, he asked pardon of Milton Macmillan for the injury he had done him. Macmillan had been standing 6-hour watches outside that door since the end of January. Elder Granger found him writing to his wife. There were 7 children in that house, and what their father had to leave them was a watch, a shotgun, a rifle, a trunk, and some books. He tells Harriet to live close to God, to read a chapter every evening and morning, and pray with the children at the bedside. Then he divides it: the watch to Renz, the shotgun to Ira, the trunk and the rifle to Walty. The other rifle, the one Fred Rankin has, sell it to him if you can. It ought to bring $10, and if you cannot get that much, sell it for less. The books go by choice: Lottie first, then Millie, then Georgia, then Ella, then begin again at Renz until all 7 have taken one. When he had finished it, he gave way to tears. Granger asked him directly whether he was innocent of all complicity. He said that he did not murder Umberger, and then that he had a letter to finish, and the elder went away. He sent instead for another minister. A.J. Beale had fired a revolver at him in the woods 18 months earlier and cut his hair with the ball, and Beale came in alone toward 10 and gave him communion. It is commonly believed that Joseph Nicely confessed his guilt to him. Beale never denied it and never confirmed it, and he was asked more than once by people to whom a denial would have been the easier answer. They came in trainloads and wagon loads, on horseback and on foot, through snow and rain that did not let up all day. By the middle of the morning, several thousand people were standing around a red brick building with handsome parapets and windows nobody could see through. There was nothing whatever to look at. One old man who had traveled 15 miles to be there had already been heard to say that he believed all the fools in the state were present that day. Some of them had photographs of the 2 brothers on cardstock signed by the prisoners themselves, the same portraits the newspaper engravings had been copied from. What happened inside is known for one reason. The official court stenographer was also a clergyman, and he stood in the exercise corridor and took it all down. At 10 in the morning, the 2 men were walked to the sheriff's office to look at their coffins, the ropes, and the new handcuffs. Joseph pronounced his coffin nice, worried aloud that the ropes might not be strong enough, and said he wanted no mistakes made. At 11:30, the sheriff's wife brought in the last meal: bread and cold chicken and custard and coffee and apples and prunes and several kinds of cake, and they ate sparingly. Their lawyers came at 11 with a reporter. Joseph wept while he talked. Fraud and perjury had put them where they were, he said. Men and women had sworn to things that were not true in order to get the reward. That reward would burn their hands now and in eternity unless they repented, and he forgave all of them. His brother, who had signed a paper the day before, was asked whether he was innocent. He hesitated, looked away, and said he would say yes, and that was all he had to say now. The last 20 minutes went quickly. Hands cuffed behind their backs, thighs strapped in a figure 8, the nooses drawn up with the knot behind, and Joseph answering that it was about right when they asked whether his was too tight. Black hoods on drawstrings, and as one of them went on the jail, janitor called goodbye through the food passage, and he answered him. David asked God to be merciful to his soul, and his brother asked his Savior to receive him. The sheriff said goodbye to them both and pulled the lever at 23 minutes to 2, and 14 minutes later, the physicians said they were dead. Outside, the several thousand were still there. What they got, after all of it, was the dull clang of the iron trap through the wall. The bodies reached Ligonier about 11 that night, and were buried the following Sunday in front of about 800 people. Of everything taken out of Herman Umberger's house on the evening of the 27th of February, 1889, exactly one thing ever came back: a black pocketbook, 7 or 8 inches long, with a white spot at one corner where the leather had been split. carried down a staircase in another county by another farmer's wife, and handed over with nothing in it. $100 was traced, and only because the brother-in-law who took it out admitted afterward that he had lied about doing so, the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania put the contents of the two pocketbooks at upwards of $16,600. Nancy Umberger, who had seen them lying in her own bureau drawer, put it at between $16,000 and $20,000 and said there had been some gold. Nothing else was found. Anthony Nicely was arrested as an accessory after the fact in the murder of Herman Umberger, and what became of that charge is not in the record. 2 farmhouses on opposite sides of one mountain, 2 searches 22 days apart, 2 old men, 2 wives, 2 staircases. In 2019, a woman in Somerset who asked not to be named went through a safe and brought what was in it to the county sheriff. Among the papers was a letter in David Nicely's own hand, offering to tell a sheriff what he knew about the Umberger murder in exchange for his life, provided that his family were protected from anything that came of it. The book written at the time had said such a note existed. For 128 years there had been nothing to look at. What is written down about Herman Umberger himself is very little, and all of it is conduct. He was 67 and had been ill since New Year's Day. He farmed nearly 200 acres and would not use a bank. He carried 2 pocketbooks in his bootlegs every day of his life, and his brother had seen them there 100 times, more or less. On his last evening, he told a hired girl to give 2 cold men chairs at his stove and to build the fire up for them. He carried the candle through his own house himself, and when a stranger asked what was in his bureau drawer, he answered honestly that he kept a little money there to pay his hands. Everything else in this story happened to other people.